Welcome to She is Resilient, a podcast for women on their healing journeys who are ready to start living their most authentic and empowered lives outside of survival mode. I'm your host, Tatiana, trauma and somatic therapist, as well as a holistic coach, and I'm on a mission to help more women heal their nervous systems. Each week, me and my guests are going to get real and vulnerable about the experiences that led us to becoming the empowered and resilient women we are today. You'll leave this podcast with the skills, knowledge, and inspiration to start creating the life you deserve. Because if another woman can do it, so can you. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of She is Resilient. Today we are talking all about setting boundaries during the holiday season because we all know that during this time it's so easy to get pulled in a bunch of different directions and sometimes overextend ourselves. So if we want to continue to support our nervous system during the holidays, we need to prioritize setting healthy boundaries. And if you've been listening for a while, you know that I've talked about boundaries on this podcast before in episode 41. And in that episode, we really went into the science of why it's so difficult to set boundaries. And if you're a new listener and you haven't listened to episode 41, I invite you to go back and listen to that one to really understand your nervous system and understand what makes it so difficult to set boundaries with others. We also talked about the difference between internal and external boundaries in that episode. So again, that's episode 41, Boundaries Will Set You Free. But today, we are not going to go into the why or the science behind boundaries. So even if you did listen to episode 41, don't worry, this is a completely different episode. So today I want to give you some language that you can use to start practicing setting boundaries. Sometimes that's what we really need to get started, right? We just need someone to show us or tell us what to say. So that's what we're going to do for each of the 5 types of boundaries. So let's start with the first type of boundary, physical boundaries. Physical boundaries refers to your physical space and physical touch. This is different from sexual boundaries, which we're going to get into later in the episode. So let's say you're at a holiday party and someone you don't feel comfortable with or someone you don't know forces a hug or a kiss on the cheek as a way to greet you. If you don't feel comfortable with someone doing that, it would be a form of crossing your internal boundary. And I say internal boundary because unless you've vocalized that this makes you uncomfortable, then someone can't know that this is your boundary. In order for it to be an external boundary, you need to vocalize the boundary. And as I'm saying this, I also just want to remind you that a boundary isn't an expectation or a rule that someone needs to follow. The boundary is about how you are going to respond. Because we can't expect people to behave in a certain way just because we tell them to. And there's no way to control that, right? Boundaries aren't about controlling other people's behaviors. It's really about what we are going to do when someone does something or says something that we feel uncomfortable with. So again, let's say you're at a holiday party and someone goes in for a hug or a kiss on the cheek. Something that you can say is, I don't feel comfortable with a hug or a kiss, but I can give you a handshake instead. Another way you can communicate this if they've already hugged or kissed you on the cheek is, I don't feel comfortable with hugs or kisses. Please ask me next time. If this happens again, I will need to step back to create a little bit more space for myself. So the first step is stating what you feel uncomfortable with. And the second step is stating what will happen if they engage in that behavior or if they continue to engage in that behavior. Of course, you can add another layer to that, another step, depending on who it is you're setting the boundary with. So for example, you can say, hey, I know you're just trying to be friendly, and I don't feel comfortable with a hug or a kiss. Please ask me next time. Moving forward, if it happens again, I will need to step back to create a little bit more space for myself. So there are so many nuances when it comes to setting boundaries, and I invite you to use your judgment. The language you use and the tone of voice you use is going to depend greatly on who you're speaking to. With a family member or a friend that you love, you might be firm, direct, but also kind and softer in your tone. Versus with a stranger who crosses your physical boundary, you might need to be a little bit more direct and less soft in your tone of voice. So let's take another example. Let's pretend that you're at the store doing some Christmas shopping, and there's a stranger in line who is standing uncomfortably too close to you. Depending on whether it's a man or a woman, you might respond differently. Right? I know I most definitely would, but again, I would use my judgment. Facial expression and body language are going to give me information on how I want to set this boundary. If they don't look friendly, if they're quite bigger than me, which, I mean, to be fair, most people are bigger than me because I'm pretty petite, but you know what I mean, then I'm going to probably use a stronger tone of voice than if it were, let's say, an elderly woman with a really kind face, right? So it's important to use your judgment when it comes to setting boundaries. So if someone is standing too close to you in line, you might just say, I feel uncomfortable with you standing too close. Can you please move back a little? Or just, please move back. I feel uncomfortable. And we hope most people will respect that and say, sure, and just move back. If for some reason they do not respect your request, then you can say something like, I've asked you to move back. If you don't, I will need to call the store manager or security, right? Depending on where you are and the severity of the situation. If that's not an option, you can choose to remove yourself from the situation altogether. And it's not avoidance, it's honoring your needs and what you feel comfortable with. The other thing I want to mention, going back to physical boundaries at a holiday party, which I forgot to mention, is that this also applies to children if they feel uncomfortable. I know growing up in a Hispanic family, you're obligated to give everyone a hug and a kiss when you arrive somewhere, but it's really important to honor your child's needs as well, right? If they feel uncomfortable, it's for a reason. And we want to teach them at an early age that they can honor themselves and they don't have to dismiss their needs or their discomfort. You can always offer alternatives when it comes to children or even with adults, right? Like even for yourself, you can offer a handshake, a high five, or maybe just a wave. So that's physical boundaries. Now let's talk about emotional boundaries. Emotional boundaries are limits that you set in terms of how much emotional energy we share or we allow others to share with us. So let's say you're at a family gathering for the holidays and one of your family members, whether it's your mom or your cousin or your sibling or aunt or whoever, shares something personal that you shared with them in a private setting. Something that you could say is, that made me feel angry, exposed, uncomfortable, right? Insert the emotion that you experienced when they did that. And when I share things with you, I expect you to keep them between me and you. If that happens again, I won't feel comfortable sharing personal information with you again. And like all of these examples, I invite you to use your own language. So if the way that I'm saying doesn't resonate with you, just use this as a guide and change up the words so that it sounds more like something that you would say. But it's important that we're clear with what we're communicating. So if you just get upset with them and you don't say anything, that's not a boundary. Nobody is a mind reader. Even if you think, well, it was clear that I was upset, so they should know not to do that again. Nope. I'll repeat that again. Nobody is a mind reader. You need to be clear with what you're thinking and feeling. Otherwise, it will continue to happen and it could continue to build more resentment and anxiety for you. So let's use another example. Let's say that you're with a friend or a family member and they start sharing everything that they're struggling with. They're venting to you about their kids, their relationship, their job, all of their emotions, and it's not something that you feel like you have the capacity for. Here are 3 ways you can set an emotional boundary with them. Number 1, it sounds like you've got a lot going on. I don't think I'm the right person for this. Have you considered talking to a therapist or a life coach? That way, you're not shutting the conversation down altogether, but you're inviting them to consider another solution besides venting to you. Also, side note, even if you are a therapist or a coach, this is your loving reminder that it is not your responsibility to be the emotional support for all of your friends and family. This was something that happened to me all the time when I first became a therapist almost 9 years ago now. People wanted advice and they wanted to emotionally dump on me all of the time, to the point where I didn't even want to tell people I was a therapist. But that's because I wasn't setting boundaries. Once I started to set boundaries, it stopped happening. So my go-to motto is, unless I'm your therapist or coach, I'm not your therapist or coach, right? You wouldn't expect a person who is medically trained to diagnose you at a gathering. You wouldn't expect an educator to teach you things at a gathering. You wouldn't expect a massage therapist to give you a massage at a gathering just because you have a knot in your shoulders, right? The list can go on with careers. You're not working 24/7. Your career or what you do for a living is not who you are 24/7. And it's important to remember that. And if you don't have the emotional capacity for something, then you don't have the emotional capacity for it, unless you want to be there for someone, right? So remember, even if you are a therapist or a coach, you can still say that you're not the right person for this. Number 2, you can simply say, I hear that you're having a hard time right now, but I don't think that I have the emotional capacity for this at the moment. Or number 3, I'm sorry you're having a hard time, but I prefer that you ask me before venting. And if setting boundaries is not something that you typically do, I know that any one of these might sound mean. And remember, protecting your own mental health is not mean. Being honest is not mean. As long as you're, again, using your judgment and using the appropriate body language and tone of voice that matches the situation, right? Like if you're yelling and you're being aggressive, then yes, that is mean. But if you're doing it in a gentle way, you're being direct and firm, but also being respectful, that is not being mean. Now, what if they continue to emotionally dump on you after you've communicated that you don't have the capacity for it? You can say something like, I've already shared with you that I don't have the capacity for this. If you continue to trauma dump or emotionally dump, fill in the blank, then I will need to excuse myself from the conversation altogether. Okay, one more example around emotional boundaries, because I feel like this one is such a common one. Let's say that you're at a family gathering or a holiday party with friends and someone does or says something that makes you upset. And instead of validating your emotions, they completely dismiss your emotions and how you feel. Here are some things that you can say. What you just said felt really invalidating to me and it really hurt my feelings. Moving forward, I'd appreciate it if you didn't make those comments. Otherwise, I will need to fill in the blank with the consequence. So, otherwise, I will need to leave. Otherwise, I will need to reconsider this friendship or relationship. Otherwise, I will need to remove myself from this space or conversation, right? Making it clear what you're going to do if they continue to dismiss your boundary. Another example of what you can say is, my feelings are valid and you do not get to tell me that my feelings are wrong. Or, if you continue to talk to me like that, then I will leave. I've definitely said that one more than once. Okay, moving on with the third kind of boundary. Material boundaries. This refers to the expectations you set regarding your belongings and possessions. This also includes money. So remember in the last episode when we talked about setting financial limits, this falls under your material boundaries. So in my family, we play Secret Santa for Christmas. So let's say I was trying to be more mindful of my finances and budget this year. So I would say something like, I'm trying to be more mindful of my budget this year, so I won't be participating in Secret Santa, but I still want to spend time together and celebrate in other ways. And let's say that they continue to push you on that. Then you can say something like, I would really appreciate it if you could respect this boundary, and if it's not something that you can respect, then I may need to opt out of the gathering altogether. Or, I would really appreciate it if you could respect this boundary. If you continue to push, then we'll need to just end this conversation here. So remember, it needs to be clear of what you're going to do if they continue to cross the boundary. I know I keep repeating that, but it's important because I think that when we set boundaries, we just expect that the person is going to honor that boundary, and that's not always the case. Most likely, they will try to push your boundary. And so what are we going to do when they dismiss your boundary or when they continue to try to push or cross that boundary? So will you end the conversation? Will you leave? Will you not go to the gathering, right? Only you can decide what feels most appropriate to do, but you need to be clear with how you're going to respond. Another way to set financial or material boundaries is, I want to let you know that I'm being mindful of my spending this year, so I won't be able to contribute as much as I have in the past, but I'm excited to celebrate in other more meaningful ways together. All right. That is material boundaries. That is financial boundaries. Moving on to time boundaries. This is another really common one, at least for me. I know I've had to set many time boundaries because I value my time, and my time is so precious. And I, especially as someone who likes to be home and honor slowness and all of that, I feel like time boundaries is something that I've definitely had to set more of recently. So time boundaries refers to how you manage your time and how you allow others to manage or respect your time. So let's say you don't have the physical or emotional capacity to attend yet another gathering or event. You can say something like, thank you so much for the invite. I appreciate you thinking of me, but I won't be able to attend this weekend. Or, thank you for the invite, but I don't have the energy to attend. Or, thanks for the invite, but I won't be able to go. And you do not have to explain yourself. You do not have to share your why, right? When it comes to time boundaries, I think many people worry about needing an excuse. You do not need an excuse to not attend something. You can simply say, I'm not going, and that's okay. Now, let's say that you do attend, but you don't want to stay long. You can say, I've had such a great time. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to head out now. Or, I appreciate you inviting me. I'm going to leave at X time, and then just say the time that you're planning on leaving. I know for me, I don't like to do anything on Sundays, and my family and friends know this about me. So if they offer to do something on a Sunday, I just say, is there another time that works for you? I like to relax on Sundays and prepare for the week ahead. And most people understand. And if they don't, it's not your responsibility to change that. Okay, and last but certainly not least, sexual boundaries. This refers to the type of sexual activity or intimacy that you feel comfortable with. It does not always mean sex. It can be any kind of sexual activity within a relationship or even outside of a relationship. So let's say you're at a holiday party or gathering and someone says something about your physical appearance. It could be sexual, it could be a sexual comment, or it could be a comment about a part of your body. If it makes you feel uncomfortable, you can say something like, your comments about my appearance make me feel uncomfortable. Please don't make those comments again. Otherwise, I will need to remove myself from this space or this conversation, right? Fill in the blank. Now, let's say someone makes a sexual comment to try to be funny. You can say something like, your comment isn't funny and it's sexually inappropriate. And you see how naturally my instinct is to be more firm with these boundaries. This is what I was talking about earlier. When setting boundaries, it's really going to depend on the situation and the type of boundary you're setting. In moments like this, I personally would never say, "Sorry, can you please not make those comments again?" I personally would be more firm because I believe that sexual comments and boundaries need to be taken more seriously. Not to say that the other types of boundaries aren't as serious, but I think that there's a fine line between sexual comments and sexual harassment. So I do believe that these need to be addressed more quickly and more firmly. So I hope you found this episode helpful. I know it was just a little bit longer than usual. I hope you can use some of this language when it's time to set boundaries. And remember that people who need boundaries are usually the people who are going to try to push the boundary. So it's to be expected that people will get offended or upset or need multiple reminders. It's not a one-time thing that people will automatically respect your boundary, unfortunately. But remember, it's also not your responsibility to make someone comfortable with your boundary. It's not your responsibility to fix someone's emotions about your boundary. So if they get upset or mad or they're frustrated with your boundary, they're allowed that. Just like you're allowed to feel all of your emotions, they're allowed to feel upset. But just because they're upset doesn't mean that you did something wrong. It doesn't mean that you need to go back on your boundary. Trust me, it gets easier over time. So that's it for now. Happy boundary setting, and I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you absolutely loved this episode, I would so appreciate it if you subscribed and left a review on Apple Podcast, or take a screenshot and share this episode on social media. Don't forget to tag me at tatiana.holistic.coach. The more nervous systems we reach, the more generational cycles we break, and the more we contribute to a kinder and safer world. And if you're looking for somatic healing services, send me a DM and I'd love to chat on how I can support you. I'll see you in the next episode.